Well, here we are continuing to work through the mission of God for the family. We looked at last week the way God sets the world up in the beginning before the fall. He sets the world up with a garden, with a land, and with the wilds out beyond the land. He gives us some different kinds of animals that live in the different spaces, and there were wild animals from the beginning, as well as animals that you might call farm animals or something like that. So from the beginning, you have these different spaces. Uh, but one of the things that I want to begin talking about is that one of the things that God immediately begins in the beginning of Genesis is to create a metaphor system to understand his calling on our lives and what our families are for. And so he goes to Adam and he makes him out of dirt, and then he takes him into a garden that is dirt, and he makes fruit trees grow up in there, right? He says fruit trees grow up. And then he creates Eve, and he says to Adam and Eve together, be fruitful and multiply, right? That they're made out of dirt. And then you have Adam brought to the dirt, and God makes it fruitful. And then he says, your job is to guard and garden this place, to continue gardening it, make it more and more fruitful, develop develop this garden and then grow the fruit in it. And then you're going to go out to the land, and you're going to bring the resources from the land into the garden, and then bring the fruitfulness of the garden out into the world, and transform the land into more garden. And we see throughout the Bible that this is one of the themes that's developed, is that things get more and more gardened as it goes along, that the world needs gardeners. And then they're going to have children, and their children are going to go out and establish new gardens out in the wild, right? The Garden of Eden is going to produce children. With Adam and Eve are going to be fruitful, producing children, and then those children are going to go out and become gardeners out in the world. They're going to take hold of the wild, and they're going to turn it into gardens, establish their own gardens, their own families, their own places throughout the wilds, right? If Adam is told with Eve that together they're going to take dominion over the whole world, well, they're going to need an army of children and grandchildren and great grandchildren to do that, right? So they're birthing gardeners. But the first thing that they need to begin gardening is themselves, right? And one another, right? That they are supposed to be fruitful. So they are made of dirt. They are the beginning of the gardening project, and they are supposed to garden and care for one another. Adam obviously doesn't do that with Eve, as the story goes. The dragon comes in, and instead of defending and gardening and guarding his wife against the attack on the Garden of Eve, he lets the dragon talk, and we'll talk about that more. But this there's an amazing metaphor system that God really gives to us here to understand what it is that God is doing, right? That that the beginning of the gardening project is not just the dirt, but also the dirt that we are made of. We want to grow in fruitfulness, and that means that our children grow up and they know how to live and how to be fruitful in the Lord, but also that we are pursuing the Lord in such a way that we become fruitful, growing the fruit of the Spirit. Jesus says, you haven't chosen me, but I've chosen you and ordained you that you should bring forth fruit, and that your fruit would remain. That whosoever you ask of the Father in my name, whatsoever you ask of the Father in my name, he will give you, he will give it to you. And these things that I command you, that you love one another. Right. So Jesus says, I'm going to restore you to fruitfulness, right? That's one of the things that I've come to do, is restore you to fruitfulness, but the fruit is going to remain throughout the generations, right? The fruit, when you produce good fruit, it's going to remain throughout the generations. And he says, what's at the heart of fruitfulness? Well, it's loving one another, right? At the heart of the restoration of fruitfulness is the destruction of the enmity between people, right? The destruction of the rivalries that have grown up between people, and it's replaced with a love for one another, right? So at the heart of what the mission that God has given to the family, it has to be a deep and abiding love for one another rather than a rivalry between the people in the family. A rivalry between a man and a woman is replaced with love, right? The hard-heartedness between a man and a woman needs to be replaced with love, right? That's the beginning of fruitfulness and the beginning of the ability to actually accomplish the mission that God has given for the world. Right? This is what Song of Solomon is all about. Right? The book is about the transformation by God of Solomon into a king that can rule his kingdom well. Well, the reason Song of Solomon is wisdom literature is because to be able to be a good king in the garden city that he's been given by God to rule, really the garden, the garden nation really is what it is. Um, that garden to rule that garden nation well, he has to begin by bringing his Eve into the project with him, right? He needs the gift of her taking on his mission as well. And so the beginning of the wisdom literature for kings is Solomon. What you've got Proverbs, which is a particular kind of wisdom, um, Job, which is a particular kind of kingly wisdom, Ecclesiastes is a particular kind of kingly wisdom, and Song of Solomon, which is a very particular kind of kingly wisdom. It says if you're going to be a good gardener for whatever mission God has given you, you have to also be a good gardener of the wife that God has given you, right? You have to and Song of Solomon is all about the ways that he loved her into his mission, that he wooed her into his mission. And now they are together on this mission. But the rivalry is replaced with a deep and abiding love for one another, right? So the fruitfulness of their marriage, of the relationship that they have in their marriage, spills out and blesses the nation of Israel, right? Spills out into the mission that God has given Solomon. And so you see Solomon gardening his wife, right, with love, until she is safe and protected. Unlike Eve, you see that she is an enclosed garden, well protected, and so when Solomon approaches her, she's open to him because she's safe from everyone else and everywhere else, and that makes her the kind of queen that he needs to be able to rule well in the mission that God has given him. And we see this also with children, right? In Psalm 128, a husband and a wife that love their children well. It says that their children, that the wife will be like a fruitful vine, and the children are like olive plants that grow up around the table. That the fruitfulness, the kind of fruitfulness that you have in loving one another within the family spills out, grows, spreads, right? And the fruitfulness extends beyond the the garden at first and extends beyond the borders eventually. So, and it's even what Paul says he is praying for when he starts talking about the gospel in Colossians 1. He says, the gospel has come to you in verse 6, Colossians 1, verse 6. It's come to you as it has in all the world, and it's bringing forth fruit as it also does among you since the day you heard and knew the grace of God in truth. Right. He says that's what you heard, right? You heard from Epaphras when he came, that he preached to you. You heard the gospel, and it produced fruitfulness in you. And he says, and we've continued to pray for you since the day we heard that you heard it and accepted it. We ask that we be filled with all the knowledge of his will and all wisdom and spiritual understanding. Right. That that you would walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing him, being fruitful in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God. Right. So he says that he says that you would I mean he pulls the language of the Garden of Eden, that you be fruitful, that you would multiply, right? That you would be fruitful in good works and multiply in your knowledge of God, right? So the be fruitful and multiply, he says, is one of the things that we're restored to. But it's also we're restored to the knowledge of God's will and wisdom and spiritual understanding. It's the Paul uses this same metaphor a lot of different times. That when the gospel goes out, one of the things it does is restore fruitfulness. And I mean, just think of Galatians 5, just really quickly, right? The law is fulfilled in one word: love your neighbor as yourself. He says, but if you bite and devour one another, beware lest you be consumed by one another, right? He says that's the way the world works, right? You bite and you devour one another, you eat one another. And then he gives some examples of that. And then he says, but the opposite is the fruit of the spirit, right? The fruit of the spirit. What do you do with fruit? Well, you eat it, right? So he's restoring fruitfulness. In this case, you feed it to one another in Galatians 5. The fruit of the spirit is love, joy, peace, long suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self control. He says, none of these things is illegal. Against such, there is no law. He's like, don't treat the fruit of the Spirit like it's illegal. These are all good things. No, so, but what we see is that Jesus says that at the heart of the restoration of the Garden of Eden is love one another, right? And we see here that Paul says at the heart of the restoration of the fruitfulness that I'm talking about is the fruit of the Spirit: peace, joy, patience, and that feeds, that you feed one another on that. And so really, when you start talking about the restoration of the family, it's really the restoration of the family to the mission that God has for it. It's really easy to jump immediately to be fruitful and multiply in a simply physical sense. Go out and take dominion. And we're going to talk about how that's a good command and that's something that we're supposed to be doing. But Jesus and Paul and Solomon and the book of Genesis all start with it growing out of a fruitfulness in the way that we live and love one another. That is what produces the kind of fruitful and multiply, the kind of dominion that's a blessing as it goes out, because we end up not having the option of dominion or no dominion, right? We whatever it is we rule over, we have dominion when we but dominion is supposed to be bringing something to its intended end, right? Bringing the good and the goodness and the glory out of the things that we find in the world. Well, that begins by being fruitful before the Lord in the flesh, right? The flesh that we have that is made of dirt, making it a fruitful garden, and then the relationships that we have with one another, being fruitful gardens in the same sort of way. Now, you can't do that and not be on mission, because a big part of the fruitfulness is learning how to be on the mission that God gives to the family together. That's a big part of what it means to love one another and be fruitful in those relationships. But we can't separate it out into a simple task list. Right? What we need is the Spirit to be producing the fruit within us of the peace and the joy and the long suffering, the patience, the love, the kindness, the goodness, the faithfulness, the gentleness, the self control. We need that to mark our families, right? If people want to know that your family is Christian or not Christian, right? Well, Jesus tells us that the mark of his people is going to be that they love one another, right? That's at the heart of a family being on mission together, and it's the one of the primary responsibilities of a husband is to love his wife in such a way that she gives the gift of joining his mission, of coming under his mission, and saying, yes, your mission is my mission too. Let's do this mission together. Um, Loving her in such a way that she joyfully joins in the mission at hand, and then loving and caring for your kids and disciplining them up into the mission that God has for them as well. So it's the metaphor system that God is developing to talk about the family really will continue to be around the garden and the land and the transformation of the wilds. But it begins with the gardening of our own souls and of our relationships. So here we go. Gonna keep on talking about the mission of God for the family as we go.